evening, and welcome to the Sherdog Radio Network preview for UFC Fight Night 188, also known as UFC Vegas 27. I am your host, Ben Duffy of Sherdog.com, and with me today, instead of my usual co-host Keith Schillen, is Mr. Tom Feely. Tom is a writer at Sherdog, where he has been doing the official UFC preview articles since July of 2018, so coming up on his third anniversary here. We've had him on a roundtable before, and it is long since time we had him back. Tom, how are you doing this evening?
Doing well, yeah. Thank you for having me back. I was looking forward to breaking down a surprisingly good card.
A surprisingly good card is a real good way to put it. And one thing in particular that surprised me about this card as I did research for this program is how many people there are in this card that I've kind of forgotten about because they've either been gone for a good while or they just haven't been that busy recently. Like from basically the first fight on the card all the way up through the main event where you've got one fight a year, Rob Font versus, Cody Garbrandt, who was off in outer space. Without going into yet, who you're picking in which fights, from a fan perspective, which of these fights, like I would say south of the main and co-main event, would you be most excited in as a fan?
I mean, if you're going that, I think the other obvious, number 3 fight would be Jack Hermansson, Edmen Shahbazyan, which, when it comes to the card, I think feel that addition, really helped bolster this card and kind of click everything else into place. From a casual fan perspective, I mean, it's always good to see, guys like Court McGee back, and, Ben Rothwell against Chris Barnett should be something interesting.
Oh, what odds would you have laid on Chris Barnett ever making it to the UFC?
That's Roque Martinez did, so I guess it's once it's that, but it's been the fun thing about the pandemic is these guys who haven't gotten wouldn't have gotten shots otherwise have been getting these more journeyman types have been getting late notice call ups, but Chris Barnett is one that came out of left field, even by those standards.
Yes, even by the standards of COVID era UFC, where just the machine needs bodies to run on. This was a weird one. I said this on my non-Sherdog show this week, that if William Knight looks like what would happen if you tried to make a human being out of bowling balls, Chris Barnett, it looks like what would happen if you tried to make a human being out of one bowling ball. He has a singular physique. Anyway, we'll get to him later. He's way up there, on the upper reaches of the undercard. But let's dive right into these prelims, if that's all right.
Let's go for it.
All right. First up at UFC Vegas 27, we have a lightweight matchup between Rafael Alves and Damir Ismagulov. Alves, the 30-year-old Brazilian, is 19-9 overall. This is his UFC debut. He appeared on Dana White's Contender Series last August, had a very impressive second-round submission win over Alejandro Flores Garcia. Then, ahead of his expected featherweight debut, blew weight by a UFC record 12 pounds, meaning he even missed the lightweight limit, and that fight was completely scotched. So here he is in presumably a more suitable weight class, and knock on wood, he makes the weight this time. He'll be welcoming back to the UFC Ismagulov. Like I said off the top, this card is loaded with guys that are really good, or at least they were really good, and you forgot all about them. Ismagulov, the 30-year-old Russian, is a sterling 19-1 overall. He is on a 14-fight win streak, the last 3 of those in the UFC, but most recently fought in August of 2019. So he's been gone for nearly 2 years. Before he left the UFC, or didn't leave the UFC, before he took off, almost 2 years, he racked up wins over Thiago Moises and Joel Alvarez that have aged very well, to say the least. Those guys, those 2 names have done a lot in the last 2 years, while he has not. The odds heavily favor the Russian. He's out there around minus 550 as the favorite. You can get Alves at plus 425, as high as plus 430 as the underdog. Tom, do those odds sound about right to you? How does this one shake out? Who wins and how?
I mean, pretty much like, Alves, he may be in his more natural weight class here, but he certainly gets a way tougher matchup this time around. I think Ismagulov might be the most underrated guy in the UFC, just as far as like not having prominent placement, not having a finish, not being a finishing machine, but just getting some wins that have aged particularly well. Who can, and like you said, who can hold his own about anywhere. Alves is a weird fighter, just a lot of big singular moments and kind of weird combinations and decisions. So I think there's maybe like, Ismagulov likes to keep things at a relatively slow pace. He's been out of the cage for 2 years. Everything's fairly by the book. So I think, there might be a shot that Alves can catch him with something weird. Like just, I think back to the Magomed Mustafayev Rafael Fiziev fight where, Fiziev is the much more practiced fighter, but then Mustafiev just immediately comes out with something weird that just, catches him off guard. But, that's a very, very low percentage. I'm basically just, it's not a really high percentage path to victory. And the odds, I think, correctly reflect that. Yeah, I mean, this looks like, it's not quite my surest bet on the card, but Ismagulov deserves to be the huge favorite. So Ismagulov by decision is my pick, just because in the UFC hasn't really been much of a finishing machine. But yeah, looks like a pretty clear one-sided fight.
I'm with you on this one, and I also see Ismagulov by decision, just because of the kind of deliberate pace he fights at that you alluded to. Like, he seems like, whether it's on the feet or on the ground, and he's equally comfortable both places, he really, really likes to feel in control of the fight.
Yes.
His style is almost calculated to minimize the possibility of that huge Rafael Alves one shot that you kind of laid out there as probably his only realistic path to victory. The other thing here is that despite the fact that Alves is, I mean, he has a stocky little tank of a man, and he, blew weight horribly for 145. Ismagulov is going to be the much, much larger man in the cage. He's got that, he's got that Khabib type body where he's deceptively tall. He's kind of got broad shoulders, and just there's a deceptive amount of muscle on him. His frame is going to be way bigger than Alves. And yeah, I don't think it's going to be real pretty. It's going to be a grindy one, but yeah, give me Ismagulov by a very one-sided decision. Probably takes all 3 rounds. Next up on the prelims, it is another matchup at lightweight, and it is once again another fight featuring a couple people that have been out of sight and potentially out of mind for a little while. Also, 2 guys badly in need of a win in the form of Yancy Medeiros and Damir Hadzovic. Medeiros, the 33-year-old Hawaiian, is 15-7 with 1 no contest in the UFC. 15-7 with 1 no contest overall. He is 6-7 with 1 no contest in the UFC. He reached some pretty high heights back in 2017 or so, but he is currently on a 3-fight skid, although they've all come against fairly sturdy competition in the form of Donald Cerrone at welterweight, then Gregor Gillespie and Lando Vannata at lightweights. That most recent fight against Vannata was all the way back last February at UFC Fight Night, Anderson versus Blachowicz 2. He'll be taking on Hadzovic, who I believe is still the only Bosnian fighter in the UFC. The 34-year-old is... Oh, is there another?
Mirsad Bektic.
Oh, of course, Mirsad Bektic. Damir Hadzovic, one of the very few Bosnian fighters in the UFC. The 34-year-old is 13-6 overall. He is 3-4 in the UFC. Much like Medeiros, he had a pretty nice little run going there, but he is on a 2-fight losing streak, having dropped a unanimous decision to Christo Tiagos and been choked out in just seconds by Renato Moicano. That most recent fight last March at UFC Fight Night Lee versus Oliveira. So this is a fight between 2 guys who have not fought yet in the COVID era UFC. They will have a stark, empty arena to welcome them back to action. The odds, a near pick 'em here. Hadzovic, the just slight favorite at -115. Medeiros, you can get him at not quite even money yet. He's out there at -105. Tom, well, welcome these 2 guys back with a little bit of a breakdown of how you see this fight playing out.
Back-to-back Damirs. Never thought I'd see the day. Between Hadzovic and Ismagulov. With Medeiros, just the inactivity really kind of masked that slide. In my head, he's still been a fairly successful action fighter, but he had that headline. He was a UFC headliner, and then basically he's pulled the James Vick of not getting the win since. I don't think things are going to get quite that dire. It's been again, you said that their losses against good competition, which makes this a bit hard to parse as far as where the floor is. Gregor Gillespie, I think, was a fight he was basically never going to win. And Vanderaa, Venata's been inconsistent enough over the last few years. I would say I thought he was trending downward, but then he went ahead and had a good performance last week. So I'm not really sure exactly where to calibrate that. And then he's been out of action. Then I didn't think he looked particularly good in the Vanderaa fight, just everything else aside. So I'm kind of a little bit down on him. And that's just a question of whether or not Hadzovic can take advantage of that. Hadzovic, I liked as a prospect. I thought he was, pretty fun puncher, but then had a really rough UFC debut. They threw him against Mirbek Taisimov, got eaten alive. And because of that, and also they gave him then Martin Held after that, which he won, but was also tough going. So he's kind of slowed down as a fighter, become much more of a cautious striker, and then has been willing to go to the wrestling as a fallback plan. So it's basically, I think early on, I think Medeiros is still going to have some more success on the feet. And then I think Hadzovic, either if he doesn't get knocked out, is going to start going for the wrestling. And then from there, I don't really know. So in my mind, it can go either way. I don't really particularly think much of Medeiros as a wrestler, but a lot of that could be colored just by, the Gillespie fight being relatively fresh in my mind as far as, in his career. I'm picking Hadzovic by decision by the wrestling, but I think it's just it could be a pretty honestly surprisingly slow and ugly fight for guys that in my head I would think of as action fighters. But yeah, I think it's going to be a close one. I'm picking Hadzovic to somewhat grind out a win in not particularly pretty fashion.
I'm just going to tell you that this show will be a lot more fun if we have dissension and we disagree on a bunch of picks. But thus far, we're batting 1,000. I see it pretty much the same way you do. And the thing about Medeiros is I think of him as kind of one of the last of the throwback Hawaiian stereotype fighters. The 2004 stereotype of all the Hawaiians is just wild, scrappy brawlers. Obviously, that's very, very out of date. That simply doesn't describe somebody like Max Holloway or Danny Gay. But Medeiros is the original. He can be a fairly technical kickboxer when he wants to, but he doesn't want to. He just wants to throw like haze. He's a surprisingly decent offensive wrestler when the mood strikes him, but a surprisingly decent offensive wrestler when the mood strikes him, but a terrible defensive wrestler. He is he's the stereotype. He's the guy, and that just doesn't fly well in the modern UFC, especially in the modern lightweight and welterweight divisions where he's trying to do this. I'm not super high on either of these guys at this point, especially with well over a year off in both cases. But I'm with you. Even if Medeiros is giving Hadzovic some stuff that he doesn't like the taste of on the feet, he'll be able to turn to the wrestling, and Medeiros won't have an answer for it. Despite the fact that Medeiros has fought at welterweight, I think of Hadzovic as probably a physically stronger guy when they get hands on each other. That plus some, fairly decent fundamental wrestling, spells, like you said, not the prettiest, but a much needed win for him because there is every chance that both these guys are fighting for their jobs.
Yeah, I believe Medeiros already said this is the last fight on his contract I've seen. And to the strength tip, and I'm not sure the exact timing, but I think it was after the Cerrone fight. I know he moved to a plant-based diet and even been talking about cutting to featherweight. And I think basically that sapped whatever physical strength, he's at. Because, he was a pretty, welterweight. He was a pretty solid, tough guy. And now it's just things, especially getting that Vanderaa fight, he just looks kind of limp. Not he's drained himself, not in a good way. He's thinned out.
If you want to be a strong vegan, just marry it early like Mac Danzig. Don't turn to it as your mistress late in your career. All right, you ready to move on to the next one?
Yep.
All righty. We now head down to the featherweight division for a up and comers meeting between Josh Culibao and the debuting Yilan Shah. Culibao, the 26-year-old Australian, is 8-1-1 overall. He is 0-1-1 in the UFC. Editorializing a bit, that draw was a split draw with Charles Jourdain that, frankly, most observers sided with Jourdain. So, take that for what it's worth. But yeah, he's 0-1-1 in the UFC. He'll be welcoming the 27-year-old Inner Mongolian Yilan Shah, who is 17-6 overall, and fought most recently on the day after Christmas in King. But he had a very, very busy 2020, including a KO loss to Zhu Rong, who debuted in the UFC, I believe, just last month. Perhaps seeing Shah as a bit of an unknown quantity, the odds makers do have Culibao as a comfortable favorite to pick up his first UFC win. He is out there at minus 250 as the favorite. Shah plus 210, plus 215 or so as the underdog. Tom, what can you tell us about Yilan Shah? And do you, in fact, believe that Culibao is going to pick up his first octagon win?
I'm still having some trouble, as some of my picks last month showed, calibrating, kind of translating up the level of competition from China to the UFC, especially on a athletic level. What I saw from Shah, looked pretty solid. But also some of it seemed to be him getting by as a better athlete. Like looking at his record, just again, like against Zhu Rong and a few other steps in competition against, like what I would consider, mid to lower level, the equivalent of mid to lower level UFC fighters, has been like the clear losses in his record, which makes, Culibao a pretty interesting initial matchup, just because the main thing that stood out about Culibao is that he's not an athlete. Heading into his UFC debut against Jalen Turner last year, looking at his fights, I was like, okay, there's some smart, stuff there as far as being a ranged striker, but athletically he's just going to get eaten alive. And I think he's done pretty well, even if the results aren't there, to kind of hang tough and be a pretty tough fighter. Against Turner, he was fighting a clear losing fight, but it wasn't really until, and he seemed to injure his leg, that directly led to the finish. So he was surviving there. And then, he was able to get a draw out of Jourdain and even had like some big moments in the first round, which is frankly more than I expected. So, okay, like he's not the best athlete, but if Shah's game is basic enough, like he seems to be, especially if he doesn't have a clear advantage, be pretty slow paced. It can be cowed a little bit. So I expect the dynamic to be basically like Culibao having some success, fighting from range, and then it's up to Shah whether or not he can close the distance and get a finish. I'm picking Culibao basically to like just coast out a decision that again may not be that exciting. Like it may just be him kind of trying to play sniper. Though I think the odds are way too wide. Like Culibao doesn't really deserve to be a minus, that big of a favorite against anyone. Like there should be a narrow favorite if anything, if not a pick 'em. But I am picking Culibao via decision.
I do love that you brought up the difficulty in calibrating a performance of somebody who's been wrecking shop in China, once they step up to UFC level fighters, because, something that I've been thinking about a lot as I think about this fight is Zhu Rong's UFC debut, where he is a guy that perhaps even more so than Shah was getting by on just being the much better athlete over in WLF. He was just bullying people around, including Shah in their fight. And then he ran up against a middling UFC lightweight that he just could not do that to. And we saw what happened. That gives me pause about Shah, because otherwise I'd be like, oh man, this guy has some value as just maybe an upset special. Just take a flyer on this guy to beat a guy in Culibao that should probably be 0-2 in the UFC right now. But because of that Zhu Rong performance, not because it's MMA math, but just because it's a nice measuring stick, I do think you're right, and that Culibao's his deficits in athleticism from a UFC standpoint, or by UFC standard, will probably they'll probably be papered over against Shah. So give me Culibao by decision as well, to finally pick up that first UFC win, and the jury will remain out over whether Shah actually belongs. The UFC Fight Night 188 prelims soldier on with a flyweight matchup between Bruno Silva and Victor Rodriguez. Silva, the 31-year-old Brazilian, is 11-5-2 with 1 no contest overall. He is 1-2 with 1 no contest in the UFC. For those who don't remember, that no contest was a second-round loss to Khalid Taha that was overturned when Taha tested positive for the whole CVS. He'll be welcoming back to the UFC Rodriguez, the 28-year-old Alaskan who made his, I believe it was shortish notice debut against Adrian Yanez back on the UFC's Halloween Fight Night card. Yanez certainly gave him a miserable Halloween, lancing him with a head kick halfway through the first round of their fight. Odds on this one do heavily favor Silva. He is minus 330. Rodriguez out there at plus 270 or so. I've got to say, I always look a little bit askance at odds this wide between two fighters who are this little known of quantities at the top level, but I actually feel pretty comfortable with this one. I feel as though, I'm not saying either of these guys is a future top 10 fighter in the division, but I think Bruno Silva is a UFC quality flyweight who's just had a rough run in terms of matchmaking, where Rodriguez, he may not be long for the octagon. Rodriguez's last loss against Yanez, it doesn't tell me too much about him, because Yanez is one of the bluest of blue chippers in that division. That was at bantamweight, even worse. And Yanez is a finisher. He's going to head kick a few more people in the first round before it's all said and done. At the same time, I can't draw too much from Silva's win over JP Bays, just because I'm not sold on Bays as a UFC level flyweight either. But so despite the fact that he beat Bays, finally got the UFC win, I actually take more heart and take more encouragement over what a tough fight he gave David Dvorak, who fights later this evening, and then Tagir Ulambekov in those two fights. That led me to think that, okay, matched appropriately, he could beat some people in the UFC. Sure enough, he was matched appropriately next and beat someone in the UFC. And I think he's going to keep that up against Rodriguez. My guess would be that it happens on the ground. Either he initiates a takedown, or, he hurts Rodriguez on the feet, maybe pancakes a desperation takedown, spins and takes the back and chokes him out or pounds him out. But give me Silva. I'm going to say this one goes to the second round. But yeah, give me Silva by second round finish, and I'm going to say it's a submission. What say you, Tom?
You basically took my exact read, except for the fact that I have a second round stoppage, probably on the mat instead of a submission. Like you, Silva was a guy who impressed me in his losses, and it was like, okay, he's athletically outgunned, but gives a hard fight every time out, and just like you said, matched appropriately, which he was in his last fight. He's looked like at least a low, a guy who can basically cut the wheat from the chaff as far as who belongs on the UFC roster. As far as Rodriguez, coming off, I know it's a bit of a ongoing joke, kind of like the Alaska FC circuit, and kind of the guys they've signed off that who've been able to do big records, and guys like Carlton Minus, and even I was gonna say Euros Medic, who I'm probably not pronouncing correctly, and even Carlton Minus. It was okay, I could at least see an idea of what's going to work here, even if in Minus's case it didn't work at a UFC level. With Rodriguez, he's a guy where just again, when I kind of scout guys coming to the UFC, it's usually all right, I don't know if this is going to work, but I can try and see what they're doing. Rodriguez was a guy where I'm not even really sure what the idea is. Kind of I'm not really sure what's could even work here at a UFC level, to be frank. The only interesting thing here is that this is his first cut to flyweight. He's been a career featherweight and bantamweight. So maybe like there's something physically that clicks at 125 pounds, like a strength advantage or something that, we have no ways picked up on otherwise. But this looks like one-way traffic for Silva. The odds are, correct in my mind. It could be even wider.
And it's interesting that you mentioned that, because one thing that's for certain is Silva is not a big flyweight. So if Rodriguez makes the weight and doesn't look like, death warmed over on the scale, he should be the bigger man in the cage and have an advantage there. That's a good point. I'll make one little side note, just because you kind of delved into the whole Alaska FC thing. One of the things I'm currently doing for Sherdog is I just rebooted a series that Sherdog's Mike Sloan did 5 or 6 years ago called Greats of the States, where he just, for each of the 50 states, he listed the best, or like the most accomplished, the greatest fighter, to hail from that state. And I've been basically rebooting and updating it. If it's changed in the last 5 years, okay, then, I let you know. Dude, 5 years ago, Cody McKenzie was the pick from Alaska. Think about that for a second. A guy that went 11-0 in Alaska, then, went, I think, 1-5 in the UFC, and just became like a running punchline from then on. That was the greatest they'd come up with. So Alaska's definitely gotten turned over on its head, because he won't even make the top 3 this time. We've got Jared Cannonier. Hell, I mean, Gina Mazzani is like 2-5 in the UFC, and she's probably ahead of him now. So yeah, it's
progress such as it is.
Yes, progress such as it is. Absolutely. All right. Let's move on. We've talked as much about Alaska MMA as I think
Cody McKenzie literally a running punchline. Well.
Shit just got real. Next up on the UFC Vegas 27 prelims, we head to what is the heaviest fight on the card up to this point, unless Rafael Alves really screws the pooch on weigh-in day. It is a welterweight matchup between Court McGee and Claudio Silva. Silva, the 38-year-old Brazilian, is 14-2 overall. He is 5-1 in the UFC. In fact, he just took his first UFC loss last October at the hands of James Krause. Before that, he had won his first 5 in the UFC and had just kind of been sneakily snaking his way, onto the welterweight rankings radar, at least. And he'll be meeting McGee. The 36-year-old from Utah is 19-10 overall. He is 8-9 since joining the UFC as the winner of the 11th season of The Ultimate Fighter. He fought most recently last October as well, dropping a unanimous decision to Carlos Condit. That extended his losing streak to 3 straight, those coming against Diego Lima, Sean Brady, and now, of course, Condit. Despite his kind of dire track record of late, this one is a dead pick'em out there. They're both out at -110. I've got to say, I'm surprised that these odds are as close as they are. I'm also surprised that Claudio Silva is older than Court McGee, because Court McGee he looks like such a spent force. He just looks so shop worn. I thought he was underrated when he came out of Tough 11. I thought, okay, here's a tough as nails guy who does a little of everything pretty well. He's not a super plus athlete by UFC standards, but whether he's at welterweight or middleweight, he seems to have like sneaky physical strength. Like the Crusher was a good nickname for him, but his kind of standard, middle of the road athleticism has become minus athleticism recently. And he just seems like a guy in all 3 of those fights. And this 3-fight losing streak, it dates back 2 full years. He lost to Diego Lima back in April of 2019. Just seems like a guy who can't pull the trigger. He's tough enough to stop some of what his opponent wants to do to him, but there's just no spark of life. There's no time really in any of those 3 fights that I thought, oh man, McGee's going to pull this one out. Like, it's just felt like a death march to me. Even if some of the fights were individually competitive, this one just feels like a bummer to me. And, Claudio Silva being 38, eventually like the wheels are going to come off. Like this isn't heavyweight. We don't get many welterweights just powering on into their 40s. But I'm not picking this to be the time to do it. I don't know if he's going to tap McGee out, but I think he's just going to completely dominate this one. I'm surprised that this is a pick'em. I think Silva's going to. I mean, he'll probably entertain McGee on the feet for a while. Just McGee's so slow on the feet these days. He's pretty hittable. It's still hard to really hurt him bad, but I think Silva will probably goof around on the feet for as long as he wants to, at least in the first round. But once he decides to bring this to the ground, I think he's going to be able to. And if not tap out McGee, I think he's just going to be able to keep him completely reacting on the defensive, just squashed the whole time. Give me Claudio Silva by lopsided decision.
Yeah, so it's I'm not picking McGee, to be clear. Just I still also wind up at Silva via decision. I'm not surprised the odds are close. I'm a little surprised that like Silva at least isn't somewhat of a fairly clear favorite, like within minus 200. Because this is basically just like McGee is basically down to more or less just like durability. Like he's hung tough. He's hung tougher than I've expected at this point in the game against, during this like 5 out of 6 losses. Hasn't gotten finished outside of Santiago Ponzinibbio. But like my thing is like the Kraus fight for Silva, like to me that was like, okay, now I can start the wheels start falling off. Just up to that point had been kind of like a relentless maniac and like would power through everything and just take downs and just the whole deal. And like looking at the numbers on volume, before we hopped on to record, I was surprised to see that Silva still threw a lot. Still threw, I think, like 216 strikes, I believe, was the number against Kraus. But just watching it on film, it felt like he was just kind of like flailing ineffectively, and just things were, just going off the rails. So it's the thing of like, if Silva loses this fight, it will be Silva losing this fight more than McGee winning it. Like there are times where, and like these are fights I often get wrong, where it's okay. The guy I'm favoring, I'm not necessarily feeling the best about him. But then the question becomes, like, all right, what can McGee do in return? Like, even though more shot version of Silva, he's just gonna do more stuff. Like he's gonna, even if he's not particularly accurate, he's still gonna be the harder hitter. Or even if I think he can take McGee down, if not control or submit him. Like I think McGee's going to be able to hang around, but then the question becomes like, all right, at a certain point, if you hang around, you have to take advantage of that, and I don't think McGee, like basically you said, has that much left in the tank in order to do that. So yeah, I think it's going to be basically just 3 rounds of Silva doing whatever he wants, and like I'm not even sure what Silva, again, 38 and coming off what I thought was a poor performance against Kraus. Not particularly optimistic about that, but this still looks like a fight that he's clearly set up to win.
Outstanding. So that's 2 picks for Silva by decision. Am I correct?
Yep.
All righty. All right. We have arrived at the obligatory heavyweight slobber knocker of the evening, as it is Ben Rothwell welcoming Chris Barnett to the UFC. Rothwell, the 39-year-old from Kenosha, Wisconsin, is 38-13 overall. He is 8-7 since joining the UFC out of the disintegration of IFL and Affliction. He fought most recently last October, dropping a unanimous decision to Marcin Tybura at UFC Fight Night Moraes versus Sandhagen. That snapped a 2-fight win streak for him over the ghost of Stefan Struve and over the Ovent St. Preux heavyweight experiment. He will be, as I said, welcoming Chris Barnett to the UFC. If you don't know who Chris Barnett is, buckle up. The man who used to call himself Huggy Bear and apparently now calls himself Beast Boy, but hell if I'm going to stop calling him Huggy Bear, hails from Tampa, Florida. He is 34 years old. He is 21-6 overall, and he is currently on a 6-fight win streak. At first blush, it may sound like you're about to be treated to, a incredibly strong dark horse prospect in the heavyweight division whose UFC debut has been delayed for mysterious reasons. Don't get that in your head. This is a 5'9", 300-pound bowling ball of a man who does flips and cartwheels in the cage. It is quite fitting that his professional debut was against Jonathan Ivey, because he is basically a palette-swapped Jonathan Ivey. Honestly, I question whether Barnett, who is taking this fight on short notice, will make the heavyweight limit, because he's fought close to 300 pounds before. Again, this is a 5'9" man, and he's fought at super heavyweights almost as often as at heavyweight over the last 4 or 5 years. Just on a week that this past Sunday, I saw Juan Adams, fight at super heavyweight here in my backyard because he didn't make the heavyweight limit. He fought at like 278 pounds. I question whether we're going to get the second super heavyweight fight in UFC history this Saturday. Well, Rothwell is a comfortable favorite, as you might expect of him, taking on a bit of a sideshow fighter. He is minus 300, as high as minus 310. Barnett's out there at plus 250 or plus 255. And part of me thinks these odds are only as close as they are because they thought it was Josh Barnett. Let me just get this out of the way. Ben Rothwell is a spent force, but he's a spent force at heavyweight, where you can be a spent force and just keep fighting and keep winning enough to stay on UFC roster for literally another 4 or 5 years. It's not just that he's 39. It's that he's 39 and he's been at least within spitting distance of the heavyweight top 15 for like 15 years now. He's in the same way that Yancy Medeiros is kind of one of the last of the just scrap Hawaiian savages. Ben Rothwell is the last of the Midwestern heavyweights who fattened up on jobbers in the early 2000s. He's a guy that I think he got his record to like 18-3 at some point, just by beating up like the Travis Fultons of the world, and like 1-5 guys in some barn in Iowa. But he's for a while there, he was a legit top 10 heavyweight. Even into the twilight of his career, he still has some very impressive wins on there. As recently as 5 years ago, he was beating up Josh Barnett and Matt Mitrione, 2 solid top 10 fighters at the time. He's not been completely out of it, even in losses to kind of fellow senior citizens like Junior Dos Santos and Andrei Arlovsky. But he doesn't have much left but power. He used to be sneaky, quick, and athletic for a guy his size, because he is a huge guy. Like, I've been in the same room as a lot of UFC heavyweights. He's one of the guys where you turn towards the door when he walks into the room just because you like feel a presence. He's a gigantic dude. And despite that, used to be kind of fairly nimble, fairly light on his feet, decent hand speed. That's all gone. Like, his athleticism is minus at this point. His gas tank, frankly, is minus. He doesn't fall over and die just because he paces himself so slowly. But if he's losing a fight in the 3rd round, I just have no faith that he has anything that he can dig in and pull out to pull out the fight. The loss to Tybura was incredibly dispiriting. Just again, kind of like I said about Court McGee in the last fight, there just wasn't any point in that fight where I thought that Rothwell showed a spark of life that made me think he was going to turn things around. Having said all that, he's going to destroy Chris Barnett. I bet it makes it to the 2nd round, just because Rothwell will be a little gun shy. He will be wary of the weird stuff that Barnett will do in the cage. Kind of like when, Jonathan Ivey did like a barrel roll at Ken Shamrock, and Shamrock was like, what the hell is this? I expect Barnett will survive to the 2nd round, but 2nd round, Rothwell is going to realize the enormous advantages in reach he has, even if Barnett is quicker, and he'll just start piecing him up, hurt him, probably chase him down to the ground and finish him with ground strikes in the 2nd round. Tell me I'm crazy, Tom.
Nah, you did steal my joke. Basically, I was gonna say I was really happy Chris Barnett is getting the chance to avenge his father Josh here. Maybe he'll wind up getting go choke too. Yeah. Just Rothwell. Like you said, like the whole thing was he wasn't fast, but he was sneakily fast for a guy that large. And the 3-year layoff with injuries and the USADA stuff, basically since coming back in 2019, he's basically been a punching bag. But the thing is, he is still big, he is still durable. It was the second that basically, at heavyweight, a shot can always happen, but Rothwell's durable enough that I don't think it's going to happen. And just, yeah, I have first round stoppage. Second one surprised me. Just, again, it's more just, Rothwell being a spent force, as you said, that would lead to it lasting that long.
That brings us to the feature prelim of UFC Fight Night 188. It is a featherweight scrap between Ricardo Ramos and Bill Algeo. Ramos, the 25-year-old Brazilian, is 14-3 overall. He's 5-2 in the UFC. He fought most recently last July at UFC on ESPN 13. He lost via first-round TKO to Laron Murphy. That did break a modest 2-fight win streak for him over Journey Newson and Luis Eduardo Garagori. He'll be taking on Algeo. The man who goes by Senor Perfecto is a 31-year-old fighting out of State College, Pennsylvania. He is 14-5 overall. He is 1-1 in the UFC, and while he is a Dana White's Contender Series alum, he actually didn't win his way onto the roster there. He is the one who infamously dropped the decision to non-killer Brendan Loughnane, and it is an eternal irony that Bill Algeo is now in the UFC while Brendan Loughnane is in PFL. Algeo fought most recently last November, taking a unanimous decision over Spike Carlisle. That got him back on track after dropping a unanimous decision to Ricardo Lamas in his debut in August. Odds on this one, pretty close. Algeo is a slight favorite at -120, -125. You can still get Ramos at even money out there, plus 100. Tom, how do you feel about this one?
Like, when you say, for whatever reason, Ramos is 5-2 in the UFC, but just in my mind, it feels like things aren't going quite that well. Part of that's kind of the nature of his two losses, where against Said Nurmagomedov a few years ago, just, basically got kicked in the stomach and just things went down from there. And then the featherweight fight against Laron Murphy, just, things were going pretty well for a few minutes, and then Murphy just immediately turned things around, and then, you look up and all of a sudden the fight is over. So it's a little bit of the, forget where I heard this comparison, but kind of like the early Charles Oliveira thing, where it's kind of, all right, can I trust him to kind of gut through when things go south? And just, the thing is, it's just, yeah, so it's a weird, he's still a guy probably on the roster, like one of the guys I at least have a feel on, because there's some really spectacular moments as far as, he had the spinning back elbow knockout of Ayman Zahabi, just, some impressive moments where it's like, okay, you've just, suddenly got a flashy finish and everything, but it really feels like he's in control of a fight. Just even against like Journey Newson, did way better than I expected, even in a clear loss, even despite the huge difference in frame there. With Bill Algeo, no such problems, even though, he's tall fighter, just, doesn't use range at all, just gets in, just tries to make stuff happen, basically, like, just tries to pressure, doesn't really care about what his opponent is coming back with. And in Algeo's case, the big thing is that gets him hit a lot, but he's been historically pretty durable, and that gets him very badly tired by the third round. So if Ramos survives that long, I think there's a chance at a late finish, that, he can turn things around on a tired Algeo, because Ramos, is capable, again, some spectacular individual moments. But after the Murphy fight, I really have some concerns that basically Ramos can start, basically can cut through things when things turn south. And I think the fact that Algeo is both like a fighter who can match him in size and reach, and someone who is just like not going to care and keep pressing the issue. I have Algeo getting a second round stoppage, but it's basically either Algeo early or Ramos late.
Okay, so I see the same dynamic you do here. The way their respective strengths and liabilities line up with each other. I think the place where we diverge here is just on how we think that's going to play out. The thing that concerns me about Algeo is, like you said, he's a big featherweight, though he doesn't fight long. Like, he just likes to come forward. He likes to get messy. He for a guy who is as long as he is, he actually seems to prefer to be an in-fighter. He's going to be way bigger than Ramos, but because he's big and because he's so aggressive, he does tire himself out, like you said. And the thing that worries me is his win over Spike Carlisle is really just because he was taking on someone in Carlisle that had even worse cardio. Like probably, I mean, Spike Carlisle probably had the worst cardio in the 145-pound division when you factor in the size of the gas tank and then how hard he steps on that gas. It makes me wonder if he'd been matched against someone else, might Algeo be 0-2 in the UFC right now? That concerns me. Certainly, he might just come out and really bully Ramos in the early going. Ramos can be caught, can be hurt, can be finished early. I wouldn't be the least bit surprised if we get a second round stoppage like you predicting, or even a first round stoppage. But I'm going to pick Ramos to survive what Algeo throws at him early on. And then the problem becomes, how tired does Algeo get? And how hittable does he get? Because Ramos is a guy that throws spectacular fight-ending offense, I mean, pretty much for as long as the fight's going on. So I'm going to go with the very, very slight upset here, and I'm going to pick Ramos by a third-round TKO. The main card starts with a very intriguing middleweight matchup that was originally scheduled for UFC 262 last weekend, which I would have seen it in person since I covered that one live. It got booted to this card, and that's just fine with me. We were fine without it in Houston, and this card needed it. It is Jack Hermansson versus Edmen Shahbazyan. Hermansson, the 32-year-old Swede fighting out of Norway, is 21-6 overall. He is 8-4 in the UFC. He fought twice last year, most recently losing a unanimous decision in pretty one-sided fashion to Marvin Vettori at UFC on ESPN 19. Previous to that, he pulled out a shocking heel hook finish of Kelvin Gastelum in just 1 minute and 18 seconds at UFC Fight Night Figueiredo versus Benavidez 2. He'll be taking on Shahbazyan, the 23-year-old Glendale Fight Club export, is 11-1 overall. He fought just once last year, where he took his first career loss in the form of a third-round TKO at the hands of Derek Brunson. Before that, as stated, he had won his first 11 fights, the last 4 of those in the UFC, after winning his way onto winning his way into the UFC through Dana White's Contender Series Season 2. Odds in this one slightly favor Hermansson. He is minus 155 or so. You can get Shahbazyan on the comeback at plus 135. And I'm just going to jump out and say I am shocked that this matchup was made. Edmen Shahbazyan, a year ago this time, I mean, the Golden Boy was the perfect nickname for him. He was 11-0. He was 4-0 in the UFC. He was getting spectacular first-round finishes. And while Charles Byrd and Jack Marshman are, they're not UFC, but I don't think either of them is in the UFC anymore. Brad Tavares was still a reliable gatekeeper to the top 15 at that point. He was the guy that if you beat him, like if you were Israel Adesanya and you handled him, it was time for you to take on a top 10 or top 15 opponent. And Shahbazyan just laced him. And I thought that marked his turnover from being a prospect to, wow, maybe this guy is an actual contender. He got turned away by Brunson, but it wasn't just a complete loss. He won the first round pretty handily against a top 10 fixture, and he came away with 2 very clear action items. He didn't have the cardio to maintain his frenetic pace if he didn't get a first round finish. And despite the fact that he's like an explosive athlete and just, fast and dynamic, he was at a strength disadvantage against a true UFC 185-pound hoss like Derek Brunson. I'm surprised that for his so-called bounce back fight, they give him Jack Hermansson, who is ranked higher than Brunson. He's wily and at least competent everywhere. And while he's not Derek Brunson, he's pretty physically strong. I mean, this is basically like throwing a drowning man an anvil. I can't believe they did this to Shahbazyan. I don't know what he did to deserve this. But basically, to me, Hermansson was a slow burn as a contender. Like 5 years ago, he did, well, I guess 5 full years ago, he wasn't in the UFC. But after his first few fights at light heavyweight, he didn't look like a future contender to me in any division. And then everything just sort of started clicking for him. And in the last 4 years, he's only lost to Marvin Vettori, Jared Cannonier, and Thiago Santos. I mean, those are top 5 guys. Hermansson can be blitzed early. He can be caught. He can be finished. So Shahbazyan could just come out and do the Shahbazyan thing. Just, hit him with just some wild, back roundhouse kick or, flying elbow strike and just put him away in 2 minutes. But if he doesn't do that, in order for him to beat Jack Hermansson, he would have had to make incredible strides in his game. Like, if he doesn't win this in the first, 3 or 4 minutes, this is rough sledding for Edmen Shahbazyan. I am not picking him to get that done. I think Hermansson is going to come out crabby from his loss to Vettori. I think he's going to come out motivated not to take another step back in the kind of ladder of contention, especially as 185, remains kind of wide open at the top. I think he's going to come out. He's going to fight a smart fight, and he is a very, very smart fighter. He's going to take, the best of what Shahbazyan can throw at him for a round, and then he's going to start rolling downhill on him. Give me Jack Hermansson by 3rd round submission.
Yeah, I see a similar dynamic. Just to tip my hand, I'm especially picking Hermansson by decision, although in making my pick, I did waffle between that and 3rd round submission. I'm wondering, my conspiracy theory is, if you remember the whole thing with the flag coming in his fight with Brunson, where he had, I believe it was like something having to do with the Armenia, Azerbaijan, like a separatist thing that got him in hot water with the Azerbaijani government and got an employee fired for letting him do the flag. So my conspiracy theory is, all right, like, this is why you're no longer the golden boy. You didn't get your step back. Here is, they put the Azerbaijani government in charge of the matchmaking for this one. Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is, so, Shahbazyan, as his winning streak showed, like, okay, he has a lot of weapons, right from the beginning, can score these spectacular knockouts early and has a lot of impressive offensive tools early. But like I said, showed that he needs to work on his wrestling and on his cardio especially, which I think, the latter, I'm hoping that's kind of why I'm giving the benefit of the doubt to at least make it to a decision, even if Hermansson's a more venomous grappler than Brunson is. The interesting thing, the thing that does give me some pause, where it's like, okay, Shahbazyan could do his Shahbazyan thing, because the initial read is, okay, Shahbazyan wins via 1st round knockout, and Hermansson, I believe. Only Thiago Santos and Jared Cannonier have been the only guys to finish him. So, it's Shahbazyan, that level of finisher. And, because Hermansson's been historically pretty durable. But even, like, outside those fights, like, looking at Vettori, also was, like, was able to lay a lot on Hermansson early. Just, I don't know if like in a 3-round fight, just even if Shahbazyan shocks Hermansson early, just how much of, like, a comeback artist is Hermansson? Like, how long does it take him to get back into the fight and get back on track? Just like his big wins, David Branch was a quick submission. So Jacare was pretty much the opposite dynamic, where he got out to a hot start and then, down the stretch, things started to get more even. And then Gastelum just, basically walked into a heel hook. So, I mean, I do have some questions that, okay, like, basically, can Shahbazyan get an early enough advantage that basically once the tide shifts, he's basically already put like 2 rounds in the bank and can hang on for the 3rd. But I think, it's likelier. There's so much similar as the dynamic of the Brunson fight. Kind of, as you talked about, even though Hermansson's probably a better submission artist, but not quite as physically strong, that, but it's the same basic thing where, if Shahbazyan can't get the knockout, he can't fall back on his wrestling as a plan B, like we saw against Darren Stewart in his UFC debut. So it just looks like it'll basically be the same fight. Though again, I'm giving Shahbazyan a little bit more credit to make it 3 rounds this time, rather than get it finished late.
All right, there you go. 2 picks for Jack Hermansson in the main card opener. Next up, it's all the way back down to the flyweight division, as David Dvorak will stake his 15-fight win streak against Raulian Paiva. Dvorak, the 28-year-old from the Czech Republic, is 19-3 overall. The aforementioned 15-fight win streak includes wins in his first 2 UFC fights last year. He defeated Bruno Silva by unanimous decision in March, and then Jordan Espinoza once again by unanimous decision in September. He'll be taking on Paiva. The 25-year-old Brazilian is 20-3 overall. He is 2-2 since joining the UFC out of the first season of Dana White's Contender Series Brazil. He dropped his first 2 fights against Kai Kara France and Rogerio Bontorin, and has bounced back with wins over Mark De La Rosa, and most recently, last July at UFC 251, a unanimous decision over Zhalgas Ismagulov. Odds are fairly close on this one, but Dvorak, the slight favorite, is out there at minus 145 or so. You can get Paiva at plus 120 or even plus 125 as the underdog. Tom, how do you feel about this one? How's it play out? Who wins?
This might be actually like, going into scouting this, I was like, okay, these are both two fun, underrated guys at flyweight. But, I think this might actually be my odds-on favorite for best fight of the night. Like, I just really love this matchup, and might be the hardest fight on the card to call, just in terms of these guys being evenly matched. Like, even if you look statistically, in terms of, just volume and everything, they're basically even. And stylistically, there is a lot of similar as well. They're both strikers that can grapple, but do that more when pressed into action rather than they'll just look to throw down first. I think Paiva is going to be the one applying, more forward pressure or at least leading the dance. I also think he's the harder hitter, but Dvorak's shown me a lot as a really interesting and varied fighter who's able to counter. The Jordan Espinosa fight was really a big step as far as showing that he can pull that off. He's athletic enough to do that against a quick athlete, which is basically what Espinosa mainly brings to the table. I just think that, basically these two are going to punch each other in the face a lot. There's not a lot, to really parse between them. So I think it's probably going to go the split decision route. If it goes to a finish, if it's a finish, I think Paiva's the likelier finisher as a harder hitter. Dvorak is a little bit better defensively. And a little bit more varied in terms of the leg kicks he showed against Espinosa, I think could pay some dividends here. So that's really all going on to separate what should be a close fight in all the best ways. This one to me is more about the action rather than the result, but I'm picking a Dvorak fight decision.
Outstanding. My concern with Paiva is his losses are better than they look, and his wins are worse than they look. It turns out that popping into the UFC and losing your first two fights to Kai Kara-France and Rogerio Bontorin is not so bad after all. They've turned out to be some pretty good fighters. But conversely, well, for one, a win over Mark De La Rosa in 2020, that might have been De La Rosa's fourth straight loss. It was, I believe Paiva was the one who booted him finally out of the UFC.
He got one more against us because I was pretending. Yeah, he got one more against Espinosa. So, which. Yeah, sick that I know that, but
and then the decision win over Zhalgas Ismagulov. That sounds great on paper because Ismagulov is a fantastic prospect, but I actually thought Paiva lost that fight, and Paiva missed weight and was the one fading late in the fight. Those are both concerning things, because if this goes all 3 rounds, as you believe it will, and as I believe it will, I think Paiva is probably going to be the more tired man in the 3rd round. So for him to win this fight, he's going to have to sock away rounds early against a defensively fairly well buttoned up guy like Dvorak. I don't see that happening. So I'm with you. I have Dvorak by decision in this one, but I would not be surprised at all if this were the fight of the night. Same as you. Continuing up the UFC Vegas 27 main card, it is a featherweight matchup between former title challenger Felicia Spencer and Norma Dumont. Spencer, the 30-year-old American, is 8-2 overall. She is 2-2 in the UFC, somewhat deceptively, as those 2 losses are against the 2 greatest fighters in the history of the division in Amanda Nunes and Chris Cyborg. That Nunes loss was her most recent appearance. It was last June. She dropped a unanimous decision. Before that, she fought last February, smashing Zara Ferran dos Santos in the first round of their matchup. She'll be taking on Dumont. Dumont, the 30-year-old Brazilian, is 5-1 overall. She is 1-1 in the UFC. She debuted at featherweight, got blown out by Megan Anderson in about 3 minutes. She then announced her plans to drop to bantamweight. She came back with a unanimous decision win over Ashley Evans-Smith, which was slightly tarnished by the fact that she blew weight by 2 steak dinners. And then in her next outing, she blew weight by the whole churrascaria, causing her fight with Erin Blanchfield, a former flyweight, we should note, to be scrapped entirely. Dumont now steps up on short notice, back up at featherweight, where she apparently belongs, to replace, help Help me, Tom. Who's
Danielle
replacing?
Wolf.
Thank you, Danielle Wolf. I keep wanting to say Ann Wolf, like the women's boxer from the 90s. Yeah, Danielle Wolf, which, frankly, probably gives us a better fight and a more competitive one. But nonetheless, they're squaring off. Spencer is the favorite out there at -160. You can get Dumont at +140. And worth noting, and credits to Sherdog associate editor Jay Petrie for pointing this out to me earlier this week. This might be a death knell for the UFC featherweight division. The problem is that Felicia Spencer is easily the second best featherweight in the UFC, but nobody is going to want to see her fight Nunes again. Crazy as it sounds, if Dumont beats Spencer, she might get a title shot if Nunes decides she wants to defend the 145-pound belt again. If Spencer beats Dumont, she might be pulling the temple down around her own ears, because not only is she the second best featherweight in the UFC, she's probably one of the very few who couldn't make 135. So tell me, does Felicia Spencer excel herself out of a job on Saturday?
Probably. I mean, like when Spencer Wolf got made, it was kind of like, all right, like, why are we doing this? But then, Wolf is basically the other woman who probably can't make 135. I'm shocked at just that she's, Spencer's a really, like, a lot of the talk on, social media, kind of in the MMA analyst community was, why is Felicia Spencer not a larger favorite? And in my mind, she's like the safest bet on the card, which now watch her lose. Dumont, Dumont, the odd thing is, she fought at a lot of like 135 and 140, prior to the UFC. So, I mean, she's made that weight in Brazil. Yeah, and like going into the Megan Anderson fight, I was like, okay, there's a lot of stuff I like here. She's able to like bully, like, and physically overmatch opponents. Then you realize, oh, she's a bantamweight moving up to featherweight, and then that's not going to work against Megan Anderson. She got smashed. So I mean, that's basically the dynamic for her. It's still a lot of aggression and will over any sort of real technique, and for her that works against bantamweights and does not work against featherweights. She's stuck in the middle. So I really hope, for her sake, she figures out how to get her weight cut in order and make it to 135 pounds. Because I mean that division's relatively wide open. In a few years, maybe she can actually be something at that weight. Even though, like you said, with a win here, she becomes immediate number one contender. Spencer, I mean, she still isn't a particularly good striker, but just the Cyborg and Nunes fights both shown that she can take an absolutely inhuman amount of punishment. So unless the thought is that, her chin is completely shot after those, which, she didn't get knocked out. So usually it's, the chin getting cracked and getting knocked out. That would be something that would make me think that. Like, I don't really see Dumont's path to victory here, since Spencer's like a legitimately solid wrestler. And, basically, even if Dumont has some success, that success is going to come with her looking to pressure, and that is just going to set her up for Felicia Spencer to take her down. And like, it's not even like Dumont can outlast her, because Felicia Spencer is also like a very good finisher on the ground. So, I mean, it may take a few minutes, but I'm picking Spencer by ground and pound stoppage, probably either ground and pound stoppage or submission. I'm picking ground and pound stoppage late in the first round.
Fantastic. Thank you. When I look at Dumont, both the limited amount of tape that's available on her before she came to the UFC, because again, she, I think, was 4-0 when she came to the UFC, and then obviously her two fights in the UFC, I get a similar dynamic with her as I do to Gina Mazzani, who fought here in Houston just last weekend. Not in the specifics of their game, because Mazzani wants to grapple and Dumont would prefer to strike, but in that their game runs on them being the physically stronger fighter. I mean, it helps if they're the better wrestler, but it definitely runs on them being the physically stronger fighter in the cage. And for that reason, Felicia Spencer is about the worst imaginable matchup for her. I can't believe these odds are as close as they are either. This is my lock of the night as well, because Spencer is brutishly strong, and she's a good wrestler, and she is a fantastic top position grappler. She's heavy on top. She's good at throwing strikes. And while, I mean, she probably could have more ground and pound TKOs if she wanted, she uses those surprisingly stinging strikes to soften up her opponents, make him give up the back. And I mean, she's choked out Megan Anderson, choked out Pam Sorensen, which is an underratedly fantastic win for her. like Norma Dumont is not going to be the stronger woman in there. She's not going to be able to fight at the range she wants. Spencer's just going to crash the pocket, throw her on the ground, just basically dump her on her head, punch her a few times, and either choke her out, or just finish it with punches. But yeah, give me Spencer by first round. I'll say submission. I'll say she softens her up and then chokes her out. And again, that crashing you hear around your ears is, Felicia Spencer basically possibly destroying her own job and maybe heading back over to Invicta or, who knows, to Bellator. We now reach the feature fight of the evening. And if Rothwell versus Barnett was the requisite heavyweight slobber knocker, then Justin Tafa versus Jared Vanderaa is the obligatory, this fight is only on the main card because it's heavyweights fight of the evening. Tafa, the 27-year-old fighting out of New South Wales, is 4-2 overall. He is 1-2 in the UFC. He fought most recently in January, losing a split decision to Carlos Felipe at UFC on ABC1, though in fairness, it should be noted that I scored that fight for Tafa, and so did quite a few other people. But take that for what it's worth. He's 1-2 in the UFC. Maybe he could be 2-1. At any rate, he is taking on Vanderaa, the man who calls himself the Mountain, is 29 years old. He is 11-5 overall. He is 0-1 since joining the UFC out of Dana White's Contender Series last November. He debuted in February at UFC Fight Night Blades versus Lewis, where he lost to Sergey Spivak by second round TKO on the ground. Odds in this one do favor Tafa. He is minus 175, where Vanderaa is plus 155. Okay. I'll never say that that a heavyweight has no chance of becoming a contender, because the thing about heavyweight is literally anybody in the world is 4 wins away from a title shot in the UFC heavyweight division. If you can win your first 4 fights in the UFC heavyweight division, you're on the doorstep of a title shot. So Justin Tafa falls in that category as well. I don't think it's going to happen, but this is my long way around to saying that, okay, I believe Justin Tafa does belong in the UFC. I am not only do I not think Jared Vanderaa probably belongs in the UFC, I'm having a tough time pointing to any one thing he does on a UFC level other than weigh 265 pounds. That's about it. I mean, his win over Harry Hunsucker on the Contender Series was one of the worst Contender Series heavyweight fights I can remember. And then, despite the fact that Vanderaa is a legitimately huge guy, like he's another of those Rothwell types where he's not that fat, and yet you can tell he probably cuts weight to make 265. He is a gigantic dude. And despite that, Sergey Spivak, one of the smaller heavyweights in the UFC, took him down at will with ease. And Vanderaa couldn't get back up, and Spivak beat the piss out of him. And there you go. Spivak is a guy who might be another win or two away from scaring the top 10. Luckily for Vanderaa, I don't picture Tafa shooting an outside single on him. That's not Tafa's game. Tafa's going to wade in and throw haymakers and some of his surprisingly effective kicks, perhaps. But even there, I think he's going to have significant advantages in speed. I think he's going to have significant advantages in power, especially with his punches. I think Tafa's going to be able to bounce into range on Vanderaa and knock him out. And if Vanderaa happens to come back with something that hurts Tafa, I could see Tafa hitting a desperation reactionary double and taking him down and either recovering or surprising himself and everybody else by, winning the fight on the ground. I've got Tafa in this one big time. And again, it's not because I particularly believe in Tafa, but I think he's probably better than Vanderaa everywhere. Give me Tafa by first round knockout.
I also have Tafa by a first round knockout. I'm still not entirely I can see why the odds are relatively still somewhat narrow. You can only trust Tafa so much. Yeah, I like some of what he does. He was only 3-0 when the UFC signed him, and just watching, all 3 fights prior to his UFC debut, his first pro debut was just absolute wild mess. And by fight number 3, it was okay, you've gotten a little bit more poise. You don't freak out as soon as someone's punching back to you. It's all right, the the growth curve, his arc of improvement looked good enough that's like, all right, if the UFC actually waited another 2 years or so to bring you in, it's like, okay, you might be ready to make an impact. As it is, he's, solid puncher with, some good ideas. As the Felipe fight showed, cardio's an issue because that just turned into an absolute sweaty mess by the end. Vanderaa, just like you said, there wasn't much available of him prior to the UFC. Fought a lot in South Africa, and then his Contender Series fight was, him getting basically, knocked around by a much smaller and probably not a UFC level Harry Hunsucker, and then just basically turning things around by being a giant dude and just, I'm using my size, I will pound this out, and then it was over. So heading into the Spivak fight, it was like, okay, as the Rothwell comparison was something I was going to make, and more latter day Ben Rothwell, that the fact that Vanderaa is big and seemed pretty durable going into this UFC debut was like, okay, is this enough to just get a win despite not really showing much else? Not really his UFC level skill being just the fact that he is large, and the Spivak fight was just nope. Proof of concept, nope, out the window. Yeah, like I mean, the thing is, like, I believe Vanderaa stoppage have all been like at least on the mat or something. So I don't trust Tafa to get a takedown quite as much as you do, as you. So I mean, I think if Tafa doesn't score a first round knockout, like basically the coin flip just says that Vanderaa is like fairly durable on this day, that Vanderaa could just like grind out a completely ugly, terrible decision that will just make us all hate life. So it's a little bit of wish casting that okay, just Tafa gets this over, done with early. Yeah, just Tafa by first round knockout, please, just for all of our sakes.
Yes. Like, let us hope that Tom Feely has not manifested into existence a miserable 3-round fight that will make us all question our life choices. That brings us to the co-main event of UFC Fight Night 188, and the co-main, same as the main, is a fantastic fight with some serious and possibly immediate title implications. It is a strawweight matchup between Xiaonan Yan and the original UFC strawweight champ, Carla Esparza. Yan, the 31-year-old, is 13-1 with 1 no contest overall. She is 6-0 in the UFC. And after the first 3 of those, did finally earn the right to fight outside of Asia. And in the last basically 2 years, she is on a 3-fight tear over Angela Hill, Karolina Kowalkiewicz, and most recently, last November, Claudia Gadelha, whom she defeated by unanimous decision at UFC on ESPN, Santos versus Teixeira. She will meet Esparza, as stated, the first strawweight champ of the UFC, which she achieved by defeating Rose Namajunas in the Tough 20 finale. She is 33 years old. She is 17-6 overall, 8-4 in the UFC, and she is on a 4-fight win streak. Those wins coming over Verna Jandiroba, Alexa Grasso, and then last May, Michelle Waterson by split decision, and last July, in a bit of an eye-opener, a split decision over Marina Rodriguez at UFC on ESPN, Whitaker versus Till. Despite Esparza's fairly impressive mid-career comeback, Yan is the favorite here. She is minus 125, where Esparza is out there at plus 105 as the slight underdog. Well, we come full circle as the original strawweight champ that I, at least, and I think a lot of others, kind of counted out against the kind of new generation that sprung up in her wake, is arguably on the doorstep of a title shot again. Certainly for as long as Rose Namajunas wears that belt, there's a rematch to be made. There's some, there's a little bit of spark there. But in order for any of that to happen, she'll need to get past Yan Xiaonan. Tom, does she do it?
Maybe. Like, I mean, this is one where, usually like hard, if there's a hard fight to call, it's usually like, okay, Like I don't really know exactly what's going to happen. It's like with this one, it's a pretty clear dynamic, but it's just a question of like, all right, putting your thumb on the scale, kind of who gets the advantage. Esparza obviously is gonna look to wrestle. That's the bread and butter of her game, and she's been able to become more effective as a striker, but the margins are just getting a lot thinner. Definitely, at least the last two, I believe, maybe even the last three of her wins have all been, or at least 3 out of the 4 on this recent win streak have all been split decision. The Rodriguez fight, basically a question I have going into this is, how Marina Rodriguez is Yan Xiaonan, just as far as being able to, at least throw offense from her back, if not just get up entirely. Yeah, Yan, again, like, as far as the wrestler, Jan, her bread and butter is her striking. I mean, the breakout win over Karolina Kowalkiewicz was just an absolutely brutal, it was tough to watch, but it was also an excellent showcase for what she can do on the feet. And so it's just a matter of, going into this, like I had, what was it, 3 weeks ago now, I believe I said something on Twitter about the Rodriguez Michelle Waterson fight, basically saying like, okay, basically I called it exactly where it's like, I'm going to pick against Marina Rodriguez, knowing as I scream that she cannot wrestle. She's going to get out wrestled at will, and she is going to win anyway. And then I'm going to wonder why I wasn't smart enough in the first place to just pick Rodriguez. And then I get to reuse this tweet, 2 or 3 weeks later about Yan Xiaonan. It was kind of because I hadn't done my scouting yet. And Yan, she's shown, looking at her fight against Angela Hill, looking at like the way, she had a tough first round against Claudia Gadela, but in the latter rounds, just basically it's like, I believe she showed enough that it's like, okay, this is not going to be a complete blowout on the mat. But then the question becomes, as far as at least, you said counter out and stuff like that. Like, again, the margins have gotten thinner as far as like, earlier on in her UFC career and when she was Invicta and stuff, it was like the fact that she could wrestle meant like she clearly controlled and like would dominate her bouts, just her chain wrestling. And it was, if she'd get in on it, it would be like, okay, that's more or less a wrap. While you're seeing against kind of the newer generation is also as she's, getting a little bit older and focusing a little bit more on her striking, that it's like, okay, there's some more momentum swings that she isn't completely controlling the fight. And she's also getting very tired late, which is another thing. So, I mean, I expect like, at least in the first round, Esparza to get the wrestling done, and then the question is, when does she get tired? And then in those moments on the feet and also from her back, can Yan basically throw enough offense with enough power to kind of make up that gap, or even score a late finish? Basically, I wrote this down and said, like, in my write-up, like, this has all the markings of a split decision, and, that's kind of going to be my pick. I'm picking Jan to come out with the nod. Just, in general, I tend to favor damage over control. But I think this is going to be a nip-tuck fight with a lot of, interesting momentum swings and stuff. But I'm going with Jan via decision.
Yeah, I feel everything you're putting down there. The difficulty that I've had with Jan is avoiding lumping her in with Weili Zhang. It's easy to do because, they're both from China. They both debuted around the same time, started winning all their fights. But there are subtle differences between the two. And one difference in my opinion, is that Zhang is a little bit better of a wrestler, both offensively and defensively. And she is physically stronger. Like, she's just like a burlier woman. Like, she's ridiculously muscled. Because of that, I do think Esparza will have a good bit of success, at least early on, getting the takedown against Yan. She's a fantastic wrestler. I really, you can make an argument that she's the best kind of technical, clinical wrestler in the division. I mean, she lost to Tatiana Suarez, but a big part of that is that Tatiana Suarez is so much bigger, so strong, younger.
And moving up to flyweight, apparently. So
yeah, and moving up to flyweight, which is frankly good news for most of the people in the strawweight division. Yeah, like this one, I agree, has splitter written all over it. And I mean, normally I don't predict a fight to be a split decision, but there are certain fights where you're like, okay, there are a lot of individual rounds that will be tough to score, and people will probably score them based on what they value in a fight rather than disagreements over what actually happened in the cage. Yeah. The fact that Esparza's gas tank can't keep up with her motor the way it could 5 years ago is definitely worrying. If that were not the case, I'd feel comfortable, or I'd feel more comfortable picking her here. I don't right now. It's tough. This would be a great story if she fought her way back to another title shot, and especially if it was a rematch with Rose Namajunas, obviously. But yeah, I can't pick her to get through Yan. This certainly has decision written all over it. Yan has 6 straight decisions in the UFC, but it'll be a fun fight. We're definitely going to have momentum swinging from one way to the other because I do fully expect Esparza to win the first round. But yeah, give me Yan by decision, and it will leave us wondering what it would look like if this were the fight night headliner and it were 5 rounds. And that is 12 fights down, and we arrive at the main event of UFC Fight Night 188, also known as UFC Vegas 27. It is a bantamweight, high-stakes contenders matchup between Rob Font and Cody Garbrandt. Font, the 33-year-old Bostonian, is 18-4 overall. He is 8-3 in the UFC. He is currently on a 3-fight win streak. That win streak coming against your new Bellator bantamweight champion, Sergio Pettis, back in 2018, Ricky Simon in 2019, and most recently, last December, Marlon Moraes, whom he destroyed with an elbow strike and follow-up punches at UFC Fight Night Thompson versus Neal. He'll be taking on Garbrandt, the former champ, a 29-year-old from Ohio. He is 12-3 overall. He is 7-3 in the UFC. He fought most recently last June, absolutely starching Rafael Assunção in the closing seconds of the second round of their matchup with a knockout of the year candidate. That put the end to a 3-fight skid for the former champ. Those 3 losses coming to TJ Dillashaw in their 2 championship matches, and then to Pedro Munoz. This one, as of the time of this recording, is a pick'em. Both Font and Garbrandt are -110. I think there's a funny kind of dynamic here, Tom, and I talked about it with you kind of off air before we started recording, that Garbrandt, he has this, like, there's a certain narrative about him that, he was gone and now he's back, even though he and Font have the exact same number of fights since 2018. I think it's been a problem for Font because he's so good. On paper, his resume should have like people marching and demonstrating outside the UFC offices for him to get the next title shot. But because he's been fighting once a year for the last 3 years, it's an out of sight, out of mind thing, especially in a division with as many spectacular highlight finishes and as many big personalities as bantamweight has. If you're just a really, really good boxer who's kind of got a genial personality, fighting once a year isn't enough to keep you kind of in the front of the public consciousness, I don't think. He has a chance here to remedy some of those problems. This will be his quickest fight turnaround in like 3 years. Garbrandt would certainly be a signature win for him. It's a matter of getting it done. And then obviously for Garbrandt, if you're a former champ, you always have a quicker route back to a title shot than the average fighter. And it's more, I think it comes into play more the more crowded the division is, which certainly men's bantamweight, counts as that. But tell me if Cain Velasquez came back to the UFC tomorrow that he wouldn't have a title shot within 2 fights. If you've had the title, I guess they figure, hey, we've already got a poster with your name on it. We just put someone else's name on the other side. I don't know what it is, but again, for both these guys, it all. The road goes through the Saturday headliner. Tell me who you have in this one and why.
Font's interesting because, for a while, my read on him was, because you look at him in his wins, and his wins just look outstanding. Just, a lot of just, he can hold his own on both the feet and on the mat. Just really, solid pressure game, really good finishing instincts, just a real lot to like. But then whenever they would give him a big step up in competition, and it wasn't so much a step up as stylistically, they put him against guys like Jan Lineker and Pedro Munoz, who were basically also looking to pressure and throw volume, and Font in those fights would always be the guy who backed off. And his last two wins, Ricky Simone, Marlon Moraes, those are a guy where you look on paper and you say like, okay, he has solved that issue. He has beaten two, aggressive fighters. The Simone fight, I mean, Simone's like a lot more of I would say a technical wild man than, those two. And even then you could see Font like would take a step back, but he would be able to kind of, smartly pick apart Simone's lack of technique and just, hit him at will, basically, just to Simone's lack of defense. So it's like, okay, you've passed, you know, that's an interesting test. How much does that carry you? And then the Moraes fight was just very weird in that Moraes just all of a sudden just looked to wrestle. And then basically, like, the way that fight played out, it was both an impressive win for Font, but also I wouldn't be surprised if 2 years from now we look back, as that's the point when kind of um, like the killing floor that is bantamweight, basically claimed Moraes as a victim, basically, like that this could be the beginning of a downslide. So I'm really curious to see just if Garbrandt brings any sort of pressure and just with the power that he can bring, how subsequent to that Font reacts. And then on Garbrandt's side, he showed a little bit more of, the brawling stuff is like, okay, you hit the button and basically he just throws everything out the window and tries to hunt for the knockout. That's well-trod territory at this point. He looked a bit more patient against Sun Sao at first, but I think even by the second round, you could see him starting to get a little bit more wild, and then he just hit that absolutely beautiful, spectacular knockout. But I think, while he may go into it's almost like I always think back to the Dustin Poirier fight, and Poirier did eventually turn the corner, but the Dustin Poirier fight against Jim Miller, where Poirier after the fight talked about like, I went in saying like, okay, not do a brawl, doing this, and like, it started at first, and then Miller brought in the faction, and then that all just went out the window. Well, I still have my questions. Like, Sun Sao was not a guy who was ever going to bring any sort of danger to Garbrandt. So basically, it's like, okay, without, even without that lack of danger, he still lost his cool, by the second round, and he had enough advantage in terms of hand speed and just, able to do a lot of stuff that he was able to just get wild and do the knockout, score the knockout. But I'm curious to see, okay, this goes one or two ways, and it's kind of like, all right, based on how Garbrandt approaches this, if Garbrandt decides to lay back and be more patient, then Font is going to pressure, and then this is going to, then basically things are going to start happening at one point in exchanges, and then it's all right, what happens first? Does Font, does Garbrandt's power discourage Font from that game plan and, cause him to back off? Or do we just get basically a replay of the Munoz fight where it's okay, like, we're just doing Rock'em Sock'em Robots? And then, the question is, like, going into the Garbrandt Munoz fight, I picked Garbrandt expecting the fight to go how it did, and it just turned out like, all right, like Pedro Munoz is just as a rock, like a head made of rocks, basically. You just can't knock him out. So I could see this going a certain, like, sooner rather than later, going into, as long as Font's willing to press the issue, going into a crazy exchange. And then it becomes, Font has, I believe, never been knocked out, but has he been hit by someone as hard as Garbrandt? And that's why I don't know. I'm choosing this to go, I could see this going the way where, okay, Font backs off and then we just get Garbrandt winning like a surprisingly slow-paced decision. But I think either if Font presses the action or if Font lays back and gives Garbrandt enough time to just start to like get wild, that we're going to get one of like those wild exchanges. Like, I think this will devolve at some point. And at that point, I basically just have to pick Font as the guy who has not been knocked out, as the guy who has not shown to go completely off the rails and implode, even though, that may not matter, and Garbrandt may just be a powerful enough and fast enough hitter that he just knocks Font out. But my pick is still Font to get the better of the exchanges, score knockout, and I'm saying it happens early in the first round.
Outstanding. I'm really happy with several points that you made there, because they kind of mirrored what I was thinking as I watched these guys last couple of fights. And it's for me, it's worth noting that the only real valuable things to watch here for me are their last couple of fights. My problem is that Garbrandt's win over Sun Sao doesn't really like it doesn't fully convince me that he's not still that wild guy, and it's for the very reason you pointed out that Sun Sao was never going to be the guy to pull that kind of performance out of Garbrandt, and even so, he still seemed to get kind of nervy and impatient in the second round. On the flip side, Font's last 3 fights, he seems to be growing in confidence and in poise, in a way that, like you say, if Cody starts to get sloppy and crazy, does not bode well for him. Font is that rare guy that, yeah, he's been fighting once a year, but he's been visibly improving between fights. And that's something you expect of a 23-year-old, but not necessarily a 33-year-old, especially when one of those layoffs was basically on the shelf with a knee injury for most of a year. Like you don't expect that. He's always been a good boxer, and the cliche I overuse is that there are some fighters who have a very good jab, but for them the jab is a tool. It establishes distance, it disrupts the opponent's rhythm. And then there are guys for whom the jab is a weapon. It breaks orbitals, it splits eyebrows open. If it catches someone off balance, it sits them on their butt, which is what he did to Marlon Moraes. And what really set up the finish was just Font destroyed him with his jab. Garbrandt will have to navigate that in order to get into the punching distance that he wants to be at. And I think Font's going to make him pay. I think Font's jab is probably going to be stuck to Garbrandt's face for a lot of however long this goes on. Garbrandt is probably the hardest hitter at 135, with all apologies to, John Lineker or John Dodson, insert name of crushing hitter here. It's probably Garbrandt. And certainly if he does navigate that distance and lands on Font's chin, we might see something we've never seen before. We might see Font staring up at the lights. I'm not picking it. I'm picking Font to be disciplined and just consistently make Garbrandt pay on the feet. Garbrandt turns and tries to wrestle. Obviously, he's a very good wrestler. He could have been a college wrestler if he didn't prefer getting in knife fights in parking lots. But I'm not picking that to happen, or if it does happen, it's going to happen once Garbrandt's already beat up and compromised, and it'll be more of a moot point at that point. I do like this to get out of the first round, but give me Rob Font by second round TKO. Couple of quick bonus questions. How close is the winner of this fight to a title shot, assuming it ends in uncontroversial fashion? Like one guy either knocks out the other or takes a very clear decision. Like how close is the winner of this to a title shot?
I mean, I'd have to think relatively close. I mean, the question is, does that title, if it's Garbrandt, does that title shot come at bantamweight? That's the other interesting thing that, he was in talk. He was supposed to fight Figueiredo, and then the whole COVID thing happened, which was another concern rather was addressed. It might be another reason really to fade Garbrandt. It's got to be right because you have the whole Jan Sterling thing going on, which I know, because I'm thinking either way. I was like, okay, is there any chance of a trilogy fight there? But I think either way, no matter what the result is, unless the result is controversial, that the Jan Sterling winner will be smooth sailing from there. So it's basically just looking really quickly at the rankings. It's got to be the winner of this fight or the winner of the Dillashaw-Sandhagen fight coming up. So I think if it is, kind of thing, if it's Sterling and Sandhagen, does the UFC go to that rematch? Then that would probably put the winner of this fight in the catbird seat. But yeah, one of those two guys. So it's like, I don't know what they would do in the interim, but whoever wins this, especially with the layoffs these guys have been having, that by the time they come back around, it could be another cycle and they're ready for a title fight.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tom, for appearing on the show with me, for jumping in, being Johnny on the spot. It is always a pleasure to have your insights and analysis on these fights. Unless you got any last thoughts, I'm just going to sign off for these folks.
No, I think we're good, because what was it? Just I think we pretty much matched on everything, right? Just
we differed on
Algeo Ramos. Was that
it? We both had Dvorak, right?
Yep.
Yeah, I think that was it. So we shall see. That does it. That's all 13 fights from UFC Fight Night 188, also known as UFC Vegas 27. I have been Ben Duffy, Sherdog Senior Editor. He has been Tom Feely, Sherdog official preview writer. Make sure to have a great week. Make sure to enjoy the fights to whatever extent that is practical, since some of these don't promise a whole lot. And of course, immediately after the main event, make sure to hop onto either the Sherdog front page or directly through the Sherdog YouTube page and join the live recap afterwards with Keith, Shillen, and myself, where we will take your questions, we will take your comments. If our picks are terrible, we will take your abuse. But between now and then, thank you for listening to the Sherdog Radio Network.